Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, sponsored by EarthX, the world's largest environmental experience, and also sponsored by Natural Awakenings magazine. Live your healthiest life on a healthier planet. Now, here's your host, Bernice Butler.
Welcome to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio today. We are now just about at the end of our third season, and we are just more excited than ever to continue to help you explore and understand that unbreakable relationship between your health and the health of the planet. Here we look at the hottest topics related to our environment and its sustainability and how they affect your health and wellness. Here, issues like climate change, plastic pollution, extreme weather events, and others will meet up with everyday impacts like allergies and asthma, digestive issues and gut health, cancers, lung and heart issues, and more. So listen in today on environmental justice, which is our theme for the entire month of September. Environmental justice and the burdens of our children. And today we're going to focus on how and why environmental issues and their health impacts have burdened certain populations of our society, and how and why these are coming for all of us. Now, environmental factors such as air and water quality are fundamental determinants of our health and our well-being. Environmental factors can lead to disease and health disparities when the places where people live, work, learn, and play are burdened by social inequities. And these social inequities, often referred to as social determinants of health, include differences in individual behaviors, cultural influence, access to health services, economic status, and literacy levels. Environmental health disparities exist when communities exposed to a combination of poor environmental quality and social inequities have more sickness and more disease than wealthier and less polluted communities, says the National Institute of Environmental and Health Sciences, which is the governmental agency that oversees all of this. And they've long worked to reduce environmental health disparities and promote environmental justice, which they define as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental laws and policies, regardless of their race, nationality, or income. Now, more than 12 million people around the world die every year because they live or work in unhealthy environments. Environmental pollutants can cause health problems like respiratory diseases, heart diseases, and some types of cancer, even perhaps breast cancer. And people with low incomes are more likely to live in polluted areas and have unsafe drinking water. And children and pregnant women are at even higher risk of health problems related to pollution. Tracking environmental pollutants is key in trying to figure out where and how people are exposed. Our laws and policies to reduce the different types of pollution can also help prevent many serious health problems and deaths. Now, environmental justice guarantees that all people have equal access to healthy, safe, and sustainable environments, as well as an equal protection from environmental harm. We witness environmental injustice when our single-use plastic, for example, is incinerated, causing air pollution in low-income communities in the U.S., or when those single-use plastics are shipped overseas to overwhelm Southeast Asian communities. We witness environmental injustice in Flint, Michigan, a majority black community that still, after all these years, still has some lead in its water. And when state violence harms indigenous youth fighting to protect their land. These are only a few, and a very, very few, of the examples of the impact of environmental injustice that highlight the necessity of centering environmental justice in our society and in our daily conversations, which is why we're talking about it now. And because you can find these situations, of course, of environmental injustice in and or near just about every community in our land. Now, decades of research show that Black and brown communities are on the front lines of environmental harms. And we have to wonder, can those long-standing injustices ever be remedied? The last 40 years of research has outlined these patterns of environmental injustice where minority communities bear the brunt of environmental degradation or pollution. And now, climate change is adding another dimension to all of this. Those communities also often experience the worst of the worst effects of climate change, fueled by risk like hurricanes and wildfires. Now, research on environmental injustice began in the late 1970s after residents of a Black middle-class neighborhood in our own Houston, Texas, found out that the state was going to permit the siting of a solid waste facility in their community. One question loomed large, huge, in the residents' minds, and that was, why was this facility being placed there in their community and not in the white nearby neighborhoods? Professor Robert Bullard of Texas Southern University, a sociologist by training, got pulled into this to collect and parse the data, and subsequently he became known and still is known as the father of the environmental justice movement. His findings were the first to systematically show that environmentally harmful infrastructure was more likely to end up in places where minority and low-income populations lived. But from the start, Bullard and other researchers were certain that Houston was not the only place where this was happening at that time. On average, studies have found that non-Hispanic white people experience a pollution advantage of 17% less air pollution exposure than is caused by the goods and services that they themselves consume. In contrast, Blacks and Hispanics bear a pollution burden of 56 to 63% excess exposure, respectively, relative to the pollution caused by their own consumption. And in April, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health published statistics linking air pollution to higher COVID-19 death rates. Looking at 3,000 counties, they found that someone who lives or who has lived for decades in a county with high levels of fine particulate pollution was 8% more likely to die from COVID-19 than someone who lives in a region that does not. The health risks posed by environmental toxins are freighted with much uncertainty as any public policy problem that we face today. On some matters, say asbestos, we arguably have both abundant knowledge and something approaching expert consensus on the matter. On other issues, our understanding is extremely limited and will probably never be definitive. According to Scientific American Journal, 3 times as many Blacks compared with whites die from asthma. Among children, this rate is 5 to 1. And in some inner city communities, 1/3 of all Black children have been diagnosed with asthma. Environmental justice advocates assert, plausibly enough, that poor and minority areas are a magnet for environmental hazards, in part because wealthier and whiter ones that are better able to defend their interests can shun them and keep them away from themselves. But whatever may have been true in the past, these days, minorities and whites alike often effectively marshal local outrage to play the not in my backyard or NIMBY game. And the environmental racism argument, unlike critiques of conventional racial discrimination, posits disproportionate impact on minorities rather than a burden borne solely by them. Again, because we are increasingly seeing and experiencing spread of these impacts to all of us. Thus, they're coming for us all, as I like to say. And often a minority area is simply one with a greater than average percentage of minority residents. And since toxic emissions, pesticide runoffs, and groundwater contamination cannot and do not neatly select their victims by race or income, then the inequalities visited upon minorities affect a great many others as well. Indeed, the range of arguably significant environmental equity comparisons is so broad that some doubtless cut the other way. For example, many Native Americans, who may still live on reservation areas, breathe cleaner air than urban yuppies, and they live further from hazardous waste than the white ethnic parts of their community. Now, this is a lot, but here today to help us unpack and explore some of this are two experts who are going to make us smart like them, we hope. We have with us today Dr. Cedric Taylor from Central Michigan University and the University of Michigan, and we have Dr. Stephanie Chambers from Trinity College in Hartford. Dr. Cedric Taylor is a sociologist and a documentary filmmaker. He holds the position of Associate Professor of Sociology at Central Michigan University and Visiting Associate Professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Cedric's scholarly and creative endeavors focus on racial health disparities, environmental justice, and visual sociology. He is the director and co-producer of a film called Nor Any Drop to Drink, Flint's Water Crisis. Welcome, Cedric. Did I get all of that right?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And our other guest is Dr. Stephanie Chambers. She is professor of political science and department chair at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Her research and teaching focus on migration, mayoral leadership, urban education, and racial and ethnic politics, and environmental justice. Stephanie's books include Somalis in the Twin Cities and Columbus, Immigrant Incorporation into the New. Stephanie is currently working on a documentary film called Dreaming in Somali, New Americans in the Twin City, and it's based upon her book. And we're excited to have both of you all, and Stephanie is just on that cutting edge of our what I like to call our climate migration problem. Welcome, Stephanie. Did I get all of that right?
You did. Thank you for having me, Bernice.
And thank you both for joining us today, and we'll be right back on the other side of our break with these two. Thank you. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods grocers, Central Markets, Sunflower Shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free online for download at nadallas.com. Check them out. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years, non-mercury with a holistic approach, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lynndentalcare.com. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation. Based on the research of nutrition pioneer Dr. Weston Price, whose studies establish the parameters of human health and determine the optimum characteristic of human diets. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a member-supported organization, and it's dedicated to restoring nutrient-dense foods to the modern diet, especially animal fats, through education, scientific research, and activism. The foundation connects local farmers with health-conscious consumers, and their annual conference for 2022 called Wise Traditions, where nearly 1,100 attendees gather for learning, demonstrations, exhibits, impressive speakers, and delicious, nutritious meals that embody the principles of the Weston A. Price Foundation. And it's coming up in Knoxville, Tennessee on October 21st through 23rd. For more information, visit wisetraditions.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on environmental justice, how and why environmental issues and their health impacts have burdened certain populations of our society, and how and why They're coming for us all. And today we have with us Cedric Taylor from the University of Central Michigan and the University of Michigan, and Stephanie Chambers from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And we are so excited that they could clear their schedules to be with us. I want to start off today with Cedric. If you talk to us about what does environmental justice mean to you and how might it be better defined? And as you talk about that, I also want to get some clarification, because there are, to me, three, there are probably more, but three of these phrases are seem to be used interchangeably, and that is environmental justice, social justice, climate justice, and environmental equity, 4. So if you tell us what it means to you and kind of help us understand the difference, if any, from all those 4 phrases.
Okay, I'll try. The definition that most people tend to use is a definition coming out of the Environmental Protection Agency. And you alluded to it earlier. We talked about environmental justice being the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people, regardless of the color of your skin, regardless of where you come from, regardless of your national origin or income. With respect to the implementation of laws, the development of laws, everybody's involved. So by fair treatment, it means that you don't have one set of people bearing a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from activities, industrial activities, governmental activities, etc. And when you talk about meaningful involvement, you are talking about the opportunity for folks to participate in decisions, to get involved, to contribute their perspective with respect to decisions that may affect the environment in which they live and consequentially their health. And they should have a meaningful voice when regulations are being formulated and whatnot. So, that's kind of the standard definition that many people use. I prefer to use Robert Bullard's definition. I think that actually is more meaningful to me personally. And his definition goes like this. Environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of our environment, health, employment, education, housing, transportation, and civil rights laws. So I believe that this actually goes further than the EPA definition, because it puts a huge burden of responsibility on us as a society, on government, to ensure that our environments are sustainable. And that definition broadens our notion of what exactly we mean by an environment or the environment. It's not just about polar ice caps. It's about, as you said earlier in the introduction, where we live, where we work, where we play, where we worship, et cetera, et cetera. And it's cognizant of the reality that our lives, and you mentioned this earlier, our lives are not compartmentalized. And, not having an adequate transportation system means maybe more air and noise pollution. And that can have, in turn, an impact on someone being able to work in a place that is healthy or get the full benefits of education. So Bullard's definition, I think, speaks to the connectedness of our lived experience and, the idea of the task at hand. So social justice is a pretty broad sort of idea. The reason why there is, I guess, some overlap between social justice and environmental justice is that environmental justice, as it's conceived or understood by some folks, it really encapsulates so many aspects of human existence that, some people would not necessarily immediately consider part of the environment, but they really should, right? So, people who care about social justice, might be very well, focused on, say, DEI issues, diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. But in the environmental justice movement right now, there is this understanding that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a very central sort of preoccupation, that we should be really focused on that sort of a thing. So, and that, having a healthy environment is also contingent on having a certain level of diversity, having different sorts of interests, being able to contribute.
So I think I hear you saying that social justice is very broad. It includes everything from education to childhood immunization to just very broad across society, but that social justice in many cases perhaps drives environmental injustices. And social justice, well, environmental justice is really a component of social justice, is what I think I hear you saying. Thank you. And Stephanie, I want to go to you now in terms of what environmental justice means to you and overlay all of that with climate justice. In my mind, and I'm in the job, and we here at Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio are in the job of explaining things to people. It just seems more intuitive to call it environmental injustice. But maybe they want to take and put a positive spin on it or something. What does this all mean? What does environmental justice mean to you, Stephanie?
Well, I think Dr. Taylor did a great job of talking about the definitions and sort of conceptualizing the idea. But I always think of it as sort of a fundamental human right that recognizes that some groups are disproportionately burdened with environmental risks, and that we have to do a better cost-benefit analysis of situations to understand how certain groups are harmed disproportionately. So communities of color, for example, low-income communities, immigrant communities, we see that across the country, and it's really an example of power dynamics in American society. And it means that we need to reconceptualize human decisions to make sure that we are evenly distributing the environmental risks that happen in this world, and not just placing undue burden on certain groups in our society. And it includes things like, thinking about healthy air, healthy, safe water, safe homes that are free from things like lead contamination, access to healthy food, which Dr. Taylor mentioned, and that's connected to transportation. So that's why Dr. Bullard's definition is so encompassing, because it brings up all of these different issues.
Why do you think environmental justice is particularly important today?
Well, there are a lot of reasons that it's important today, and I think it's been important for a very long time, but we're getting, an increased sense, or the general public is getting an increased sense, that the issues that are disproportionately and unfairly affecting low-income communities of color, indigenous communities, that those issues are not just limited to those communities, that they affect all of us. And I think we should have been thinking that this was important even before middle income and upper income communities were realizing they were affected as well. But we're at a moment where I think people are realizing it. And it could be the attention to climate change, that it's affecting all of us. It could be the issue of air quality, and that there are no borders between, for example, low-income areas of a city and wealthier suburban areas, that air travels. I've written about that myself. And so I think that we're at this unique moment where people are learning that environmental justice consequences don't have the same borders that we thought about before, that, it's poor people who don't have any power. That was never okay anyway. But I think that other communities are now seeing that it matters.
Indeed. I think it's time for celebration and parades and turning flips by the environmental justice movement, because people have finally been realizing what they've been researching and demonstrating and proving for about the last 40 years. And like so many things in our society, when you say that they are applicable or to a certain group, then the rest of us who do not perceive ourselves in that group, we take it totally off our table. Oh, that doesn't apply to me. And we don't even bother to listen to it one bit. And that's why I think it's time for celebration, because the world realizes this is an important problem. We just have a minute to go or less before we go to break. And after we come back from the break, I really want to break it down and then reconnect all the dots so people can really understand how and why they must care about it and why it's important. So we'll be right back on the other side of the break with Stephanie Chambers from Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and Cedric Taylor from the University of Michigan. Thank you, guys. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. To today's show on environmental justice, how and why environmental issues and their health impacts have burdened certain populations of our society, and why and how they're coming for all of us now. And we are back with Cedric Taylor and Stephanie Chambers, and they are making us smarter about all of this. Again, thank you all for being with us. And I want to go back now to Cedric. Help us connect the dots for our listeners about how and why the undue burden on low income and minority communities affects us all. Give us some examples.
So I think on one level, it's a moral question on the kind of world that we wish to have and the reality of our connection to folks that we might not think are connected to us in the first place. Some years ago, I had done a presentation, a keynote on Martin Luther King Day, and I discovered that a lot of what inspired environmental activists later on, came from a lot of what he had said in his speeches. And one quote that I think many of us are familiar with is, "An injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," right? That, of course, was from the letter from a Birmingham jail. And so if we subscribe to the idea that we're all God's children, if we know that we share humanity, then, of course, environmental justice is absolutely unacceptable no matter where it happens. If we subscribe to the idea, the promise of an America that espouses reality, even if it has practically been elusive, the idea that some of us are footing the bill with our health is in itself unacceptable. But of course, I understand that individualism is a dominant cultural trait, and not everyone can be swayed by that moral argument.
But you know what? I think that now is that time, though, when there's a great big light from outer space being shown on the whole world, illustrating all of this, all the way from COVID-19 to the current Ukraine war. I mean, how far away from us is all of that, but how are each and every one of us feeling the impact? And so I think a great deal of the coming of age of the environmental justice movement across the board to everyone is the recognition and the recent demonstration of the interconnectedness of the planet.
And I absolutely agree with you, but, there are still climate deniers. There are people who are invested in not telling the truth or not acknowledging what is, abundantly clear to people who are paying attention. Just to go further, that same sort of a quote that I just mentioned, the whole quote about the fact that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality and tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I'm kind of paraphrasing a little bit that quotation. So, you may not live or work in a low-income or minority community, and you might not live in what some activists call a sacrifice zone, but it doesn't mean at some point you won't be affected directly or indirectly. So, for example, understand that the entities and interests that drive pollution of so-called throwaway communities are insatiable, right? So their prime directive is to maximize profit, to expand industry, expand capitalism, commerce, increase profit. And given the finite nature of the physical environment, it's a no-brainer that the rights of most people will at some point be infringed as land is increasingly contested. But also understand that these communities are also canaries in the coal mine, right? So, and we can look at these communities both as being tragic but also instructive. And what I mean is, think about the fact that you may not live beside a coal-burning power plant. You don't live beside a chlorine production facility. But understand that the mercury, when you go to a restaurant and you eat fish, the mercury content in that fish is directly related from what's coming out of those plants. So you may not be living beside a plant and having asthma and having cancer, but understand that this is just one example of how, we are fundamentally connected.
I think, too, wouldn't you think, too, that the enhanced research is showing people the same thing? The stuff that's coming out of that smokestack does not miraculously stop when it hits the zip code line. And I think people have been able to see that an example of that, say, for example, in the, the Saharan red dust coming from Africa. I know we see it here in Dallas. And so I know other parts all over this country, people can see it. That is an unequivocally potent example of how air pollution, particulate matter travels, and you can't miss it. So you know that if it travels from the Saharan desert in Africa, boy, it sure can travel from across town or up the street. Stephanie, you wanted to weigh in on that?
Yeah, well, I wanted to weigh in because the issue that really captured my attention to the issue of environmental justice was in my backyard in Hartford, Connecticut. And I started to do research on low-income communities of color that had come together with they were through a nonprofit, educated themselves about all of the problems related to a trash-to-energy burning facility. Connecticut or Hartford was actually taking trash from other states and burning it in a trash-to-energy incinerator, and communities were affected, high cancer rates, asthma, all of these health problems that were a result of this. And it was these communities that gained the education to talk about it, communicate the message. It sort of goes back, Bernice, to what you were saying about the victories of the environmental justice movement. These, people on the bottom of the power structure mobilizing and saying enough is enough. But they convinced suburban, liberal, white church members, progressive church members, that this air quality issue affects us too. So they came together, and it's been a great example of shutting down a trash-to-energy facility that was burning trash in the Hartford area, and that's great. So we've shut it down, so we don't have to worry so much about the future in terms of mercury, arsenic, lead, and other contaminants in the air. However, the question is now, where is this trash going? And I think that's the piece of this. We are all part of this problem. If it's going to another state and another community and being burned there, if it's being shipped abroad and burned there or put in a landfill, these are huge problems for us, for all of us.
Indeed. And I venture to say that just about every community has within it some environmental justice, or I like to say environmental injustice issue in it or near it. But the other thing I just came to my attention as you were speaking there, Stephanie, is that these low-income and minority communities are the real heroes, because it is their research, their activism that is showing everybody we have this problem. And as they show we have this problem, it becomes pretty obvious it doesn't stop at our borders. It just unduly burdens us. So they are the heroes. They are researching. They are getting the studies done. They are educating the rest. They are our environmental heroes by way of just trying to take care of themselves and highlight the injustices that have been perpetuated upon them. I wanted to ask both of you all, but again, I'll start with Stephanie. What do you see today as the top 3 environmental justice or injustice issues that are impacting low-income and minority communities the most in terms of health and lives and economically?
Okay, so I think one of the biggest ones that comes to my mind is our poor siting decisions. So decisions about factories or other infrastructure decisions, and the history in this country of placing harmful factories and other entities in communities that are already overburdened and suffering.
So you would say poor industrial siting decisions.
Yeah, industrial siting decisions.
Okay.
And that includes things like highways ripping through communities. There are all sorts of implications that are social as well, but there have been environmental issues. So that's one issue. Climate change is another big one that we can talk about. Major weather events that have led to, climate refugees and other communities. I was just reading about, Jackson, Mississippi today, about water issues that they've been struggling with. Climate change, flooding, water insecurity could include water shortages. And then I would also say lack of investment in infrastructure. And I think Dr. Taylor could talk about that, I think, much more efficiently than me in terms of like the Flint water crisis and the way that when we have a lack of investment in certain communities, those communities end up suffering. So Flint is a great example of that, or an unfortunate example of that. It's not a great example. It's an example in point.
Okay. And we've got just a minute and a half left. And so, Cedric, I'm going to hear from you briefly in terms of what you see or your experience has informed you are the top 3 environmental issues that most impact low-income and minority communities in terms of health and lives lost as well as economically.
I mean, I definitely, concur with, Dr. Chambers. And the scary thing about it is that with respect to climate change, I don't think we at this point even fully can appreciate some of the changes that are going to happen coming down the pipeline, so to speak. So, I mean, we're making meaningful progress where that is concerned, but I don't think we fully understand all of the implications or can anticipate all implications that are coming from climate change.
We're going to go to break now, and we'll be right back on the other side with Dr. Stephanie Chambers and Dr. Cedric Taylor. Thank you all. We want to give a shout out now to our sponsors. That is Natural Awakenings, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex Magazine, the Green, Healthy, and Sustainable Living Authority for the DFW Metroplex and North Texas communities. Print issues of Natural Awakenings can be found in all Whole Foods markets, natural grocers, Central Market, sunflower shops, and many, many other locations, as well as available free for download online at nadallas.com. Our other sponsor is North Haven Gardens, serving the Metroplex since 1951, the most respected horticultural establishment in North Texas, offering gardening and plant education, concierge services, DIY classes, gifts, and more. Check them out at nhg.com. Our other sponsor is Lynn Dental Care, practicing dentistry for over 38 years, with a holistic approach, none mercury, looking at the whole body. Specializing in periodontics, Dr. Lynn is board certified by the International Academy of Oral Medicine and Toxicology. Check them out at lindentalcare.com. And our other sponsor is the Weston A. Price Foundation, which is based on the research of nutrition pioneer Dr. Weston Price, whose studies established the parameters of human health and determined the optimum characteristics of human diets. The Weston A. Price Foundation is a member-supported organization that's dedicated to restoring nutrient-dense foods to the modern diet, especially animal fats, through education, scientific research, and activism. It connects local farms with health-conscious consumers. And their annual conference for 2022, called Wise Traditions, where nearly 1,100 attendees gather for learning, demonstration, exhibits, impressive speakers, as well as delicious, nutritious meals that embody the principles of the Weston A. Price Foundation. And it's coming up in Knoxville, Tennessee on October 21st through 23rd. For more information, visit them at wisetraditions.org. Thank you, sponsors. Welcome back to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio, to today's show on environmental justice, how and why environmental issues and their health impacts have burdened certain populations of our society, and how and why they're coming for all of us. And we're back with Stephanie Chambers and Cedric Taylor, and they are making us all much smarter about all of this. I want to start now with you, Cedric, where you have made an astounding contribution to moving the field forward with your filmmaking in the making of Nor Any Drop to Drink, Flint's Water Crisis. So I want to ask you, what was most eye-opening for you about that whole Flint water situation, and how have you seen that change? Have you seen things since the situation there was first exposed?
I did encounter a lot of stories, when I was in the community. And it's been a number of years since we wrapped up production in 2018. But, some of those stories still haunt me, and they'll always stay with me. And, one quick story really is about a woman who was in the kitchen one day, and her husband called out to her from the living room. He came in, she rushed in, and he basically was, saying that the vision in his left eye had dimmed, and moments later, he couldn't see out of that eye at all. Sometime later, the doctor, retinal specialist, informed him that he had suffered an eye stroke. One daughter nearly died from Legionnaire's disease, another one has organ failure. There are a lot of stories like that, so many stories that never made it into the film, and, it's just, really, really tragic. I could talk about how resilient people are, but, and that is true. But right now, in terms of how things have changed, yes, many of the lines piping is being in the process of being replaced. But I think the psychological trauma, lack of trust is going to be a reality for quite some time to come.
Have there been any national policy or law changes that can help prevent something like this happening in the future?
They have, the state of Michigan has, in a few years, will reduce there's a certain threshold where if since there's a certain amount of lead beyond 15 parts per billion, then, all these resources are kind of mobilized to do something about the problem. That number is now being dropped to, I think it's about 12 parts per billion, I think it is. But you may want to double check that in a couple of years. But, yes. So, there has been, kind of a re-examining of some of these laws, an effort to try and strengthen the lead and copper rule, and really kind of reorient our ways in which we deal with, cities like Flint that have come upon difficult times. But in terms of, where we go from here, it just means that, we have to be more vigilant. More and more communities are paying more attention to their water systems.
I think, too, and I would like to see perhaps some national law or national policy or legislation, because that then, too, celebrates the vigilance of the folks in Flint, Michigan, and highlights, like we talked before, how it is on their backs, and because of these low-income and minority communities doing the research, suffering the ills, that we can all get better, lifting them up.
I was just going to say that, I'm going to put on my political scientist hat here and just mention that, all of this is so steeped in power. And yes, we need to celebrate the achievements of the groups that have sort of against all odds been able to make progress. But we have a situation, and I'm reminded of, Texas and the state legislature there, where we have a lot going on in terms of voting rights and who gets elected to office and how districts are drawn. And our state legislatures already across the country have been dominated by suburban legislators. Sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes those suburban legislators, depending on the suburb, depending on the state, depending on the politics in the state, are more concerned about wealthier income constituents than they are about the poorest people. And when we think about some of the cities like Flint, like Jackson, Mississippi, cities that have predominantly people of color who are in need of these types of infrastructure repairs, sometimes they don't get the support from the state. And the cities just don't have a lot of money to do what needs to be done to protect and support people. So it's all very much steeped in politics and power. And I think that's an important thing for us to think about as we think about strategies for improving our cities, our lower income, middle income areas as we go through the year.
Indeed. As we talked about, that's a big issue with the environmental justice movement, but they keep making it happen. But that's why I named the show It's Coming for Us All, because we are increasingly seeing this other voices added to the usual overburdened communities of low income and minority. For example, in our power grid situation here in Texas, while it may have been low income and minority communities who were least able to deal with the effects, numbers wise and economically, it was more higher income communities who felt the effect. And so, again, that's why we named it It's Coming for All of Us. And the sooner that we all recognize that, then we will get more help for those low-income minority communities. But I think people are already beginning to listen to them because, as one researcher said, and I think certainly plausibly so, our low-income and minority communities who have been traditionally overburdened, they really are the barometer for the future. What we see them going through is going to become highlighted and more widespread everywhere. So as we look at them, depend upon their research and activism and watch them, we know it's coming for us all. So we better start doing something now, and we better start listening to them. And again, you all see that with your work. And Stephanie, your work intrigues me because I know that they have the large Somali population there in the mid-cities, but kind of encompassing that too, we really are beginning to see around the world, even though I don't think it's being rightly defined, but we are really beginning to see the climate refugees. and the environmental migration?
Yeah, so most of my research on Somalis doesn't necessarily involve environmental justice. I mean, at the same time, we can look at a country like Somalia, and they've been dealing with, severe drought and famine. That didn't fuel the refugee crisis to begin with. That was political, but it's certainly very important and is affecting the lives of people that I work with. But I will say that living in a city like Hartford, it's been really interesting and disappointing, concerning to see the effects of climate change in areas like Puerto Rico. So, part of the United States, a very important area for residents of Hartford. We have a very large Puerto Rican population. And as Puerto Rico has dealt with natural disasters, we've seen climate refugees coming from that island, which is part of the United States. But we also see these things happening when, people in Miami or in Houston or other places in the U.S. come to other states as climate refugees. It's happening internationally, but it's happening within the United States. And I think that's, like you said, a wake-up call.
I have to think that you all are seeing a swelling of the Somali population there, too. As things become worse in their home country, I imagine more of them are immigrating to the U.S., and they're going to immigrate to where there's already a population node.
Sure. I mean, I don't have figures on the number of Somalis who are applying for refugee resettlement, but the refugee resettlement process takes a really long time, and it's predominantly fueled by people who are in politically unstable situations. But starvation is certainly an aspect of it.
Briefly, half a minute, Cedric, for you to tell us real briefly, what can ordinary people do in their everyday lives to help drive solutions?
Yeah, I would just basically say pay attention to what's happening politically, get to know who your representatives are, where they stand on environmental issues. If they're on the fence, move them or remove them if necessary. So a lot of it comes down to being, active politically. It's not enough to just vote every 4 years, but be active in the community, right throughout.
Indeed. And I would add to that, if you've got an issue, find the like-minded people in your community and join up with them and act. And we want to thank you all very much. We've been with Dr. Stephanie Chambers with Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, and Dr. Cedric Taylor with Central Michigan University and the University of Michigan. And they really have made us smarter today about what environmental justice or injustice is and is not, and why it's coming for all of us. So thank you all very much. And thank you, listeners, for listening in today to Healthy Living, Healthy Planet Radio. The conversation starts here, but our goal is for it to continue in your home, in your social circles, your workplaces, at the water cooler, and in the grocery checkout line, so that we can all work together to realize that healthy living is simply not possible without a healthy planet. Our culture is the result of 1 trillion tiny acts taken by billions of people every day like yourselves. And each of these tiny acts can seem insignificant, but all of them add up, one way or the other, to the change that we each live through. This is your host, Bernice Butler. Thank you for listening today, and join us again next week for more on environmental justice and the burdens of our children. Thank you.